afternoon. Let's go ahead and get started. It's a little after 1:30. I'm having some Wi-Fi issues, so hopefully everyone can hear us. There is a lag in our screen, but I think our presenter will be fine. Welcome to the 39th Oilfield Strong webinar. It's amazing that it's been that it's lasted that long and is going strong. So appreciate everyone supporting it. We have a great topic today. My name is Grant Swartzwelder. I'm president of OTA Environmental Solutions, and we're the sponsor for the Oilfield Strong webinar series. Today we have Gani Sagingaliyev, who's the co-founder and CTO for ESG-Dynamics. We've been hearing a lot about ESG clearly, but ESG-Dynamics is taking a different approach, focused more on data and data analytics, which is very different than what some of these groups are doing with standards and proprietary calculations for certifications. It appears that ESG-Dynamics is really looking more at the grassroots, kind of very granular data and building up from there. So look forward to hearing Gani's presentation, and I think he's got a case study that he's wanting to go through, which will be good. I think opening question, Gani, is fitting with what I just talked about. Why is what ESG-Dynamics doing with more of the data type focus, how does that differ than so many of the other standard and certifications out there? And what are the benefits or weaknesses of that?
Well, good afternoon, Grant. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Grant, let me know if you can hear me.
You're fine.
Excellent. All right. So glad to be on the webinar. Thanks for having me. And I think we'll have an interesting discussion today. You're right. ESG has been increasingly important in many aspects of what we do in the energy industry. And we've seen a lot of increased disclosure requirements. We've seen impacts on capital availability, all those things you really know about. We can talk a little bit about the SEC and EPA things coming forward. But really what we were trying to focus on as ESG-Dynamics is on attacking the sources of emissions for our clients. And a lot of our clients are operators. And instead of giving them a score, we're telling them, hey, here's what we're seeing on a operational level based on the data that we collect from a diverse group of sources. Here's what we're seeing for your operation. Here's how you're comparing to your peers in this area. Here's what you could potentially be doing better, down to specifics on a lease or well level, saying out of all the leases operations you've got, here are the highest priority areas that we think you should really look at. And when you present it in that way, it's really a clear conversation that leads to informed decision making, that ultimately leads to priorities being set in the right direction in the right areas, and leads to reduced emissions at the end of the day, which is our goal.
Very good. Well, so, and what was interesting is that early on, I thought that the data that the oilfield had was really good, and then environmental activists were saying, no, it's bad data. And I think what you've seen and what we'll demonstrate is that the oilfield does not have the best data. The issues with not having good data when you're presenting, can you discuss that?
Yes, of course. Very good question. Very good point. I think there's been criticism of the quality of the data that's being reported. Ultimately, regulations are not meant to be optional, right? And we've seen issues with reporting. We've seen issues in inconsistency of reporting from agency to agency, and we can clearly demonstrate. Actually, as part of the case study we're going to look at today, we'll look at some examples of that. And at the end of the day, that's the best data we have on the industry as a whole. right? And though it's not perfect, it's a data source that we can go to, that we can work with, and actually through the process of identifying those inconsistencies that we can talk about, highlight, bring to the attention of either our clients or the industry through webinars like this, then our goal is to improve on that. And I think there's room to improve, but there are clearly companies that do a fantastic job at regularly, consistently reporting their data, and there are groups that really need work in that regard. So you're right, there are two sides to this coin, but that's the data we work with, and we're getting to know it pretty well, actually, in the process. So we're hoping to make an impact with our clients, and we're already doing that, as we'll demonstrate today. And I also thought, before we jump into that case study, I spend a couple of minutes just talking about what we do as ESG-Dynamics. We get a lot of questions about, well, what do you guys actually do? And we've been so busy past 3-4 months working on numerous cases. We've been doing work with NGOs on joint research papers, and our team's been super busy that we've are now working on upgrading our website to reflect what we actually, the expanded services that we now provide. So tune into that after mid-April, and it'll be much more clear. But I'll spend a little, have one slide here I wanted to show on that. There we go. So whether you choose to work with our web accessible subscription-based energy modules via the Energy Modules Explorer, and some of the snapshots that you've seen at the on the first slide, and use that to streamline some of your workflows, free up administrative resources to do things that are more important to the business, and really focus your time on impactful decision making, or you could employ our advisory or consulting teams to perform targeted analysis and support the insights, bring out the insights that really matter to your business at the end of the day to make it an impactful outcome. And in that, we have a number of different items that we do, things that we do, directions that we can take. For some, it's really important to understand where they are relative to the competition. So that'd be more of a performance and benchmarking type of project. We're doing a lot of regulatory compliance and reporting, and that's super important, especially with the SEC movement that we're seeing. So that consistency in reporting compliance is going to be that much more important. And certain companies that wish to perhaps go public, that is super important. Other companies that are looking to potentially divest some of their assets at some point really need to align their assets and their performance with their potential buyers, because the ESG KPIs, those metrics, whether you're dragging those metrics down or in the opposite direction, matters now in the A&D world. And with that, we're also doing some A&D advisory work where we're bringing those conversations on the front end of a contemplated transaction or asset search versus the back end.
So explain that a little bit more on the A&D advisory side, that why would your benchmarking, how could your benchmarking or how could your data compliance audits be used in an A&D environment?
A simple way to think about that, when and I've been on the A&D side for some time. When we're looking at assets, potential acquisitions or divestitures, we're looking at, hey, what does make sense for this potential operator? Does this fit their portfolio? Does this fit their acreage? Does this help their efficiency in making this extraction method more economic? How are they going to add value to the asset after acquisition? Today, another important metric as part of that is, hey, how is this going to impact the environmental performance metrics of this organization? A good example was the case with Conoco and Shell last year that we've talked about before, where the acquisition of Shell's assets for Conoco really improved their metrics in that basin. Now, whether or not that was the driver of the acquisition, I cannot comment on that. But the fact of the matter that was the outcome. And in transactions today, we're seeing that it is becoming more important. If you are a seller looking to sell to perhaps a company with a bigger portfolio, you have to really understand where you stand relative to them, what you can do to get closer to their performance measures. Maybe you're already there, but if not, what tangible steps can you take to get there, to be more attractive as an acquisition target? Or perhaps you're a buyer looking for an asset and you're saying, look, I've got all these great internal consistent practices that lowered my emissions. Now I can take on operators that are perhaps not doing that well and bring them to my standards. Let me see which operators could fit that bill, and we can help with that.
You know, it used to be that you talk from a financial standpoint, whether it's accretive or not. I'm proposing that there's a new term called ESG accretive, where you're having to look and see, like you were saying, whether this property, what does this property do to your ESG standing? Is it accretive? Does it make you a net positive, or does it make you a net negative? And amazing that that's now becoming a major consideration.
Yes, that's absolutely the case, and you should coin that, Grant. That's a great term to use, ESG accretive.
So everyone listening, don't trademark that. I'm going to go out and trademark that. So thank you. So it's why don't we go into the case study, because then I think that you can bring up some points using actual charts on to explain kind of what you're looking at from an ESG and a data standpoint.
Yes, let's do it. Let's do it. So this is a real case study. We've redacted these slides, so we're not going to show any names. We'll just state that this was a client that operates in the Eagle Ford. And what we've done for this client is what we call the health check. We do regulatory compliance audit. We'll look at all of their data, report it to all of the applicable regulatory agencies. We use our internal tools, obviously, to make it an efficient process. And then we come back with our observations, with our recommendations on things, where we think they excel, where we think they can do better. And depending, of course, on the internal conversation with the client and why they're doing this particular study, we gear some of our work and some of our discussion in that direction. In this particular,
so why did they even hire you? What I'm sure it's because they love the environment and love ESG, but what were they hoping to get out of this?
All of those things, plus I think the operator is potentially contemplating a divestiture at some point in the future, in the short term. And with that in mind, they wanted to ensure that the potential set of buyers would look at this asset and look at the not only at the technical aspects of the quality of the rock and the economics, but also, hey, how great this asset really is environmentally, and that it's accretive to our operation, that it could actually pull our operation in the right direction in terms of those KPIs. So I think that was the goal, to really make this an outstanding asset in terms of ESG performance.
Makes sense.
So, as part of that, we've done several peer groups when we've done the benchmarking. We'll look at one peer group today. I don't think we have time to talk about all the different peer groups that we've benchmarked and studied for our client. But one peer group was, the potential buyer universe, right? And you say, hey, here's where they are. We probably need to be closer to that and to be an accretive acquisition. But also, we've done a peer group comparison closer to the relevant size of the organization of the operator. And that way, if any of those companies are in the running to also divest their assets, you can see today how much differentiation there is between your operation and your competition's, right? So those were the key groups that we looked at, mostly focused in this area. All of the groups we're going to look at, or comparison companies we're going to look at today, are Eagleford companies as well, or companies with operations in the Eagleford that have been ring fenced in the Eagleford, and not other operations take consideration. But before we started, we said, look, let's just look at your key emissions categories, and that would help us focus on the right categories where you can make the most impact in the shortest amount of time. And when we looked at the entire US oil and gas production by category, 91% of all of those emissions are in 6 categories. And then we compared that to the clients' categories, and one actually jumped out right away, that they have no natural gas pneumatic devices, something that represents close to 23% of the US emissions per company. They are at 0, which is fantastic. So they're starting at a great place. At the same time, fuel gas was a big category at 30%. Flaring at over 50% was a very big category. And then the rest more or less in line with the industry. Obviously, your diesel is somewhat tied to your activity levels. So if you got somewhat less in drilling completion activity using diesel-powered fleets, you'll be lower in the spectrum. So we said, okay, we need to focus really on flaring, fuel gas, and really dig into those 2 categories at the state level. And let's also look at the federal level. Let's look also not only at CO2, but also methane intensities, and see how all that looks. At the end of the day, this is a very condensed scorecard with all the figures really removed. But we came back with the recommendation that flaring should be attacked first, and with very specific, least specific recommendations there. And not because they were at 57% of the total, but also because relative to the peer groups, that was a category that was really standing out. Fuel gas, the company was actually doing very well and in line with the basin average, though the leaderboard is a bit below that. There's rapid electrification going on, which is leading to better outcomes in terms of fuel gas usage. And this company is actually really focused on electrification. So I expect their metrics to continually improve. On other categories, they came out fantastically well, which is great to see. We didn't see any air emission events or hydrocarbon liquid spills. We definitely confirmed that our findings with the organization, which was confirmed. So that was a great outcome. So let's look at some figures here, right? The process that we went through. And in the process, we found a few inconsistencies that we pointed out to the organization, and they've taken steps to remedy. This is one of the benchmark groups that we've identified really by size, by production. In the Eaglefords, we also wanted to focus on oilier companies. Since this was an oilier company, we highlighted some of the gassier peers. Obviously, pure gas companies were just not considered in this benchmarking. So that's the QC/QA process we take and do on the front end. We want to ensure that companies we compare are comparable to our clients. And as you can see on the flaring side, with the exception of company E, which we'll not name today, they were still on the higher end of flaring in the basin relative to their peers of their size. And when we looked at the bigger peer group, they were doing even better. So that was an area to focus on. Fuel gas intensity wise, somewhat opposite story, as I was saying, that they were doing better relative to the specific peer group. But when again, you look at the basin leaders, they're generally below 3% today on average. However, this is one trend that we see, be it in the Permian, Eagleford, and actually all across the US, fuel gas usage is increasing as a percentage of production and in absolute terms as well. Whereas flaring is taking is going in an opposite direction. I think today in Texas, we're at 0.2%, which is in recent history, a record low. So we're definitely improving. So when we looked at the company, the total gas use intensity wise, which is another metric we use sometimes, they had some room to improve to be in that top quartile range.
I know here you're talking about benchmarking. A lot of folks are talking about standards and certifications and rankings, but you've got kind of an opinion on why benchmarking is a better way to go right now. You might explain that.
Well, the way we see it is we're looking at real data on a specific metric. It's really difficult to look at a high-level company score and make sense of that, because there are a variety of different organizations that are trying to develop these metrics, these scores, and none of them really correlate at the end of the day if you compare them side by side. So what do they really mean, right? And how can they lead to actionable decision-making by the organization looking at that score? What we're doing here is we're saying, look, here's a data-driven metric, real data reported, your real data, and here's where you stand on those real terms, and here's what you can do on a field level to improve that. So I think that's where we try to differentiate ourselves and bring in actionable intelligence to our clients, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that definitely. Sorry, continue. Sorry.
Then we dug into the flaring side. As I was saying, flaring is definitely improving statewide, and we can see it in peer aggregate trends. These companies, obviously, in aggregate, driven by one company here, company E, is not showing exceptional results, but the overall trend, as with most places, most basins in Texas, are coming down since that peak in Q3, Q4 2019. Everything is trending down. Now we looked at specifics of our particular client here, and we saw spikes. You would see flaring come down, then it spike up, and we thought maybe it's relative to drilling development activities and such. And what we realized is that this is a growth company that continues to acquire assets that are not necessarily up to their own internal standards. So what they end up doing is acquiring assets. It does come with a higher flaring portion. Then they go in and start remedying that and continuing to bring it down. So that creates this up and down a bit. And that, that's a story that we could piece together using the data. Now, at the end of the day, they still have a lot of work to do. And in one of the slides coming up, we'll show you the distribution of this flaring on a lease by lease level relative to production and such. And really what was important here is to not only look at the data, but also sense check the data. And we found in both flaring and fuel gas use two potential issues. One was that though production was reported consistently through all of the months that we're looking at, there was a lack of reporting on the flaring side. We highlighted that to the operator, so that could be operator's system not properly sending in their data. This could be a railroad commission issue where they're not processing the data either timely, or maybe there's some break in the system. The fact of the matter is that the company had flaring happening during that time. So this was a good catch on our end for them to go and investigate. Another item that we've identified in the process, and again, this is in the public domain, right? So when you talk about consistency of the data, it's important to make sure that what you really have and sent in is really what happened. Another example was on the fuel gas usage, and we said, look, guys, what happened here? You're at this steady trend. We understand why the uptick happened in Q2 2020, but what really happened in this 6-month stretch? And this ended up being a reporting issue. System calculations changed on one end, were not reflected on the other. So they were sending in the wrong information for about 4 months. So now they're going to go back and fix this, send in a correction, so this goes away. But unless this is brought up to the attention of the operator, this data would still be out there, right? And it's an inconsistent report, if you will. And another big takeaway with the client was we looked at these are top 25 performing leases by production, and we looked at all of them. We highlighted a few, but really the biggest contributing leases, and we had this discussion live with really the decision-making guys at the organization. And looking at this, they said, well, why do we have this happening? Let's take a look. And we had a live discussion around this particular lease. There was a live conversation around what is to be done to reduce the flaring amount on lease number 2. So with that taken care of, their leasing dropped from 7.7 to 4.9%, which is still high, but that one lease made a big impact. And by looking at it in this way, they were able to really prioritize their efforts in the right areas. We've done
about taking that data to a level where they can actually do something about it if they want to. I know with OTA, we provide data to a lot of operators, and you really wonder whether they do anything with that. It seems like what you're providing should allow them to make operational changes if they so want to.
Absolutely. And you can really sense check some of this data. For instance, one of the leases here, I think lease number 8, you look at the production of the lease, and then you look at how much that lease takes in terms of fuel gas usage. Makes you think about what is it that's driving that operational expense, first of all, per BOE in that area. Let's look at that. Let's figure out what's driving that. Perhaps there's an efficiency to be gained here, even on the operational level, because at the end of the day, electrification is not only good for the environment, it's also good for your bottom line, right? It saves you dollars in many places. So that was another discussion we've had, that, and the operator actually, we didn't have to tell them this, they fully understood that electrification is a commercially sound thing to do. We've also looked at, apart from apparent emissions, we've looked at sources of potential emissions. And in this case, we've looked at all of the inactive wells within the portfolio of the organization. And this particular client actually does fairly well. Out of the total fund of wells, less than 9% are inactive. That sounds high, but when you look at certain areas especially in the state of Texas, that number goes, into hundreds of, not hundreds, but several times inactive versus active wells, right, ratio-wise. So in this case, they were doing fairly well. They had the largest well funds out of the total, but the best performance in terms of their shut-in wells and temporarily abandoned wells, and all of the inactive or non-producing active wells that we've identified, they've put back on production that was actually part of the acquisition that was integrated, and those wells were now flowing. So very good message to the operator. We've given them green lights and everything here, but also highlighted that there was one well that wasn't active for over 10 years, that's something they should look into and remedy, so it doesn't just sit there idle.
What this seems to do is it gives you more detail than just whether it's an orphan well or an active well, kind of what type, how long, because obviously a well that's been inactive for 10 or 20 years is different than a well that's been inactive for 1 year. So you can, it kind of helps you kind of really see what your reliability really is.
Correct. And in this case, this was a fairly simple case, right? We're looking at cases where, you've got 400 TN8 wells, you got several hundred shut-in wells. then you really want to look at the distribution of those wells. Where are these wells? Why are they there? Is this something that should be prioritized on an area operation level, or then we have a slightly different conversation. But you're right, this leads to real outcomes, real prioritization of efforts to remediate, really understand whether or not there's a future with these wells, especially on the ones that are sitting there over a decade, whether or not you're actually going to come back and do something with these. Because at some point, mechanical integrity becomes an issue, and you might as well, even if you need to re-enter that reservoir, drill a new wellbore. So those are liabilities that are important to understand. They're not, part of your greenhouse gas emissions inventory, but these are liabilities that can lead to real consequences, and we've seen that happen and throughout history, but a few notable cases in recent history as well. What we do also is Grant, we'll look at methane intensities. We'll look at the EPA reported data. We've pulled up the entire history for this organization and every organization that was in this benchmarking report. And I think I have a slide coming up on which companies should have reported and didn't, or reported inconsistent data. But we had a conversation with this organization on, hey, what was happening here really with your reporting? It goes from something higher, then drops off, and then back up. Is this a reporting issue? Is this your operational changes, that assets coming in and out of the organization? And it ended up actually being that, which explains the discrepancies here. But at the same time, we've had cases where we saw a similar picture for an operator, and would come in, and really it was a misunderstanding of what you should be reporting. Instead of reporting your entire inventory, certain operators were only reporting their new inventory. So then, of course, you see a story that doesn't make much sense. We've also, through our energy modules, looked at the entire history of this operator's spill reporting, when the last spill was, all the details around what happened there. And really, it's an insightful story for a company that may have a bit more than these. This company is done real well, especially with no emission events or spill events in the last 5 years. Outstanding performance. But when we especially look at processing plants in areas very well, you'll see an emissions report twice a week, for instance. And then there you can really dig in and figure out what's causing those, where are they happening, why are they happening. So that's a targeted conversation. That's what this tool is for, is to quickly find that data, look at it, parse it, and have a targeted conversation around what the key factors is. Again, in this case, it wasn't a big factor, but it's something that we can definitely do for folks.
Unfortunately, as we all know, the oil industry doesn't have the most credibility as far as data, as far as how it performs, whether that's perception or reality. But what seems like you're highlighting is some inconsistencies and some data that might not be filed correctly, and that just feeds into the narrative of what the larger public perception is about the industry. So this seems like it highlights areas where the industry can clean up its own reporting, its own data, and be able to stand a little more true to the public on what it's able to do and what it's been able to do.
Yes, because at the end of the day, it's our social license to operate at stake. On top of that, you've got regulatory pressure, so you better make sure you have consistent reporting and accurate reporting. And then, it's access to capital, like you and I discussed. It's becoming more and more important. And when you see, a slide like this, where this is something we do before we start the benchmarking report to ensure that companies we're comparing actually have consistency in reporting between state and federal regulatory agencies. So this is that comparison, and 50% of the companies had issues.
And so
And
you're in kind of a catch-22 because SEC, EPA, public wants you to present more data, but then if you don't have control of your data, you're setting yourself up to kind of catch yourself or be caught, inadvertently in providing bad data.
And in many cases, Grant, these are not very difficult remedy cases, right? It's mostly simple miscommunication or simple understanding of specific reporting requirements. In the case, for instance, with our client, we saw a slight inconsistency in the production that's been reported to the state versus the feds. And it ended up being that there was miscommunication between the company that was putting the report together and the internal engineering group. That's it. Very simple. Then, of course, you're always thinking about, hey, do we report in a gross numbers, net numbers, whatever it is, it's always gross, but those are items that are also highlighted. So in this case, we've seen companies that have misreported by up to 50, 60% their production to the EPA versus the feds. On flaring emissions, we just picked one area to compare. We've seen half companies having issues. Most of these companies that did not report, we feel like they should have reported. They should have had an EPA report filed for that particular year. In some cases, we've seen companies report up to 50% higher flaring rates to the EPA than the Railroad Commission. In some cases, the other way around. So there's a lot of inconsistency, Grant, and there's going to be a lot more scrutiny around this with, especially with the SEC. The EPA is going to tighten rules. So I think operators that had not done this type of analysis on their performance should, on their consistency of reporting should, and definitely align internal groups that are responsible for these items to communicate, to work off the same set of data, same accurate set of data, and that would lead to a much easier life, less violations, investigations, citations, all those TIONs you want to talk about.
Gani, we're running out of time. I don't know if you have additional slides or if that was the last one, but
well,
kind of your last point, and then we'll close it up.
Yes, thanks, Grant. Two key points. One is we have evolved as ESG-Dynamics into not only a technology, but also a solutions company. So we're helping clients hands-on, our teams, our professionals with a deep experience base in the oil patch are helping operators, a lot of people we know really well, improve their metrics, consistency, and such. So we're here to help. And if you're just starting out on your ESG journey, reach out to us. We can have a conversation around what we can do for you. Really, whether you want to leverage our energy modules or some of our teams of professionals, we can bring the insights forward that will, at the end of the day, matter to you and lead you to more informed decisions. Thank you, Grant, for having me here.
Yeah, thank you, Gani. Appreciate everyone's participation. Reminder that next webinar will be Robert Anderson, CEO of Earthstone. Earthstone has been acquiring quite a bit out in the Permian, and he's going to talk about the integration of all their acquisitions into the Earthstone family. So I think that'll be very, very interesting and very timely. Have any questions or want to get a hold of Gani, let me know and I can get you his information. Gani, thank you for your time. Everyone, appreciate your participation, and we'll see you next month.